My name is Dr. Christoph Laucht. I'm a lecturer in 20th century British history at the University of Leeds, and I'm a specialist in nuclear and Cold War history. Today I will be talking about the emergence of the nuclear threat and the origins of the Cold War. Let me talk about the historical context of my talk. First, the Cold War. It is the defining conflict that occurred during the second half of the 20th century, from about the end of the Second World War to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which then led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. What was the Cold War? The Cold War was a global conflict between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. It created a bipolar world order. The United States were the superpower leading the Western camp, including Britain, France, West Germany, and later also led the military alliance NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Soviet Union was the superpower which led the Eastern Bloc, Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and so on, and later also led the military alliance called Warsaw Pact. During the final stages of the Second World War, first cracks started to appear amongst the Western allies, especially the United States on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. The Western allies believed in liberal democracy, free, direct and secret elections, whereas the Soviet Union believed in Marxist-Leninist doctrines and had a socialist definition of democracy. There were particularly issues about Poland and the future of Germany after the unconditional German surrender in 1945. And at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, these became clearly visible. In the Far East, however, there also appeared increasing issues between the Soviet Union and the United States, in particular over the possible entry of the Soviet Union into the Pacific War against Japan. One area, one event where this was particularly visible was the Berlin blockade of 1948-1949, which has also commonly been called the first battle of the Cold War. Stalin decided in 1948 that he wanted to cut off West Berlin, the western sectors which were occupied by France, Britain and the United States, and which were situated within the eastern zone of occupation which the Soviet Union had occupied after the end of the Second World War in Germany, and so they tried to cut off any connecting lines between the Western occupation zones and West Berlin and tried to reunite West Berlin with the Eastern sector. However, the Western allies, in particular the United States and Britain, reacted by launching a massive airlift operation to supply the city with vital supplies. And again, this shows you something about the nature of the Cold War. It wasn't a direct military confrontation here, but rather logistics were involved and also a lot of propaganda. So why was the Cold War a Cold War? Why was it a Cold War and not a hot war? And this is where the nuclear threat came into the picture. As has been argued by historians, the presence of nuclear weapons prevented the Cold War from turning into an all-out nuclear war between the Eastern and the Western blocs. And you may have heard about the notion of the nuclear deterrent, the idea that the presence of nuclear weapons actually deterred any potential aggressor from attacking one of the two sides. In Central Europe, this became particularly clear in Germany, which the historian Thomas Lindenberger has also called a border region of the Cold War, as Germany was divided and would have become the potential battlefield of an all-out nuclear war between the two blocs. While the Cold War never turned into a large-scale hot war, proxy wars frequently occurred in places such as Korea, Vietnam, or Afghanistan. In these small-scale conflicts, the two superpowers fought each other indirectly. The historian Odd Arne Westad has examined superpower intervention in the so-called Third World also in his influential book, The Global Cold War, shifting focus also away from Europe and Asia and also towards Africa. Now let me talk about the emergence of the nuclear threat in more depth. In order to understand the emergence of the nuclear threat in relation to the early Cold War, we need to go back in time a little bit to the beginning of the Second World War. It is important to understand that refugee and scientists from National Socialism played an important role in sensitizing and mobilizing Western governments, in particular the governments of the United States and Britain, to create nuclear weapons programs. Because there was a persistent fear that an atomic bomb in the hands of Adolf Hitler might pose a serious threat to global security and might lead to unprecedented devastation. In 1939, the famous Einstein letter was drafted by refugees from National Socialism in the United States. Albert Einstein, of course, the famed physicist, was behind this, but also the Hungarian-born emigre physicist Leo Szilard. And he actually played a more critical role in this, and he primarily used Einstein just for the sake of his name and to exert more influence on the US government. However, this letter is normally overstated in the historiography on the origin of the nuclear threat and the development of nuclear weapons. There's another much more important document which was crafted in 1940 in Britain by two German-speaking emigre scientists, the so-called Frisch-Peils Memorandum. Otto Frisch was an Austrian-born experimental physicist, and Rudolf Peils was a Berlin-born theoretical physicist. And they crafted this document together in February 1940, in which they clearly stated that an atomic bomb is feasible, and they warned that Adolf Hitler might pursue such a weapon. Now, many of these emigre scientists used to work with Werner Heisenberg, a key figure in the Nazi project, before they were forced out of Germany when the Nazis came into power because they were of Jewish origin. This document, the Frisch-Peils Memorandum, then led to the creation of the secret tube alloys project in Britain. Again, this is a cover-up name. Nuclear weapons research is conducted in secrecy. However, it becomes clear quite early on that the British government does not have the financial resources to push on with this project. And so it is decided that the United States and Britain pool their nuclear resources and knowledge. And so in 1942, the famous Manhattan Project is created. Again, a cover-up name to disguise the true nature of this project, named after the headquarters of the Manhattan Engineering District of the US Army Corps of Engineers, which was headquartered in New York. But again, this is a cover-up name. And Canada also becomes quite important in this project. And there are three chief sites in the United States where research and development is going on at the time. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, uranium enrichment takes place. In Hanford, Washington, the plutonium enrichment program is underway. And finally at Los Alamos, and this is perhaps the most important of the three sites, some of the world's brightest minds at the time are gathered to develop the atomic bomb. Some of the famous physicists working at Los Alamos include J. Robert Oppenheimer, the director of the Los Alamos Laboratory, but also refugees from National Socialism, Hans Bethe, the famous German-born scientist, as well as Viktor Weisskopf, a Viennese emigre scientist. They were working on two kinds of nuclear weapons, a plutonium implosion bomb and uranium fission bomb. However, while this work, of course, was largely theoretical, it is not until the 16th of July 1945 that the first atomic test is conducted in the area around Los Alamos. Los Alamos is situated in the southwestern United States, in the state of New Mexico, and so a remote region there is chosen for the first test, which is called the Trinity test, and takes place in July 1946. Initially, the scientists are not quite sure about the consequences of this test, and there's actually a betting pool going on whether the bomb would be a dud or whether it might actually destroy the entire state or even set the entire atmosphere of the world on fire. However, Hans Bethe, the aforementioned physicist, calculates that the bomb would not trigger a chain reaction in the atmosphere, and so they go ahead with their test, and the test is a big success. The Trinity test, of course, was conducted in secrecy, and a cover-up story was devised which informed readers of local newspapers that a local ammunition depot had exploded. It is then not until the 6th of August 1945, with the dropping of the atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, that the world public is introduced to the existence of the atomic bomb. 3 days later, another atomic bomb is dropped on the city of Nagasaki, and now the world public becomes fully aware of the existence of nuclear weapons. And initially, this sparked very mixed public responses between nuclear dystopia about actual fears of the nuclear threat, of an impending arms race, fears that tapped into religious belief that now it would be possible that man could actually destroy the entire planet. Whereas at the same time also stories emerged about peaceful applications of atomic energy. And so there is in parts of the population a true atomic euphoria about the seamlessly endless potential of nuclear energy, nuclear reactors, nuclear-powered cars, nuclear-powered planes, and so on. Scientists, however, also reacted to the dropping of the atomic bombs, and many of those who were involved in the Manhattan Project form organizations to educate the public about the atomic threat, but also to promote peaceful applications of atomic energy and to launch a more objective, as they often call it, educational campaign to explain the benefits of peaceful atomic energy to the public in Britain and the United States. In Britain, the Atomic Scientists Association is founded, and this is modeled on an American group of scientists called the Federation of American Scientists, which is still around today and which is perhaps the world's most important national group of the movement of atomic scientists. Initially, these groups promote the international control of atomic energy as a kind of remedy to and an antidote to a dreaded atomic arms race. They argue that by pooling atomic resources under the control of a supranational organization, in particular the United Nations, an atomic arms race could be averted and nuclear war could be prevented. However, by the summer of 1946, these plans fail as the US government desperately tries to maintain its atomic monopoly, which it had at the time. And what the US government did is that it cut off other countries, in particular its allies Britain and Canada, from any nuclear information in an attempt to maintain nuclear weapons for itself and to maintain a leading position in the world in this regard. When we talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it is of course important to remember that science fiction writers and popular science writers had imagined nuclear weapons before 1945. In 1914, H.G. Wells, for example, talks about the use of atomic bombs by the 1950s in his story The World Set Free. In 1932, Harold Nicholson published a novel called Public Faces, in which he described an imaginary nuclear explosion. And again, so now we have this radically new weapon in 1945, but of course this has been imagined in various ways before and become a reality, but again, tapping into earlier imaginations. What then really intensified the nuclear arms race was the first test of a Soviet atomic bomb in 1949. This now meant that the second superpower was also capable of developing and building its own nuclear weapons. So this put the United States in a slightly awkward position. And in February 1950, US President Harry S. Truman announced that his government would now also pursue the development of the hydrogen bomb, which is a much more powerful nuclear weapon, which uses a quote-unquote conventional atomic weapon to trigger a larger atomic reaction by using hydrogen. And again, this was theoretically debated at the time, but now the US government decided to push ahead with this program in order to beat the Soviet Union in the race over the hydrogen bomb. And the hydrogen bomb really is a game changer when we talk about the emergence of the nuclear threat. While conventional, and again I call them conventional atomic bombs were measured in kilotons. So 1 kiloton equals 1,000 tons of conventional explosives, TNT. They actually had to invent a new unit of measurement for hydrogen bombs, megatons. So 1 megaton equals 1 million tons of conventional explosives, TNT. And just to give you an idea of this, the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated was a Soviet test of a 50 megaton device. So that's 50 million tons of TNT. So now the coming of the hydrogen bomb really intensified nuclear fears, and also at the same time nuclear testing became a real issue during the 1950s, as both the United States and the Soviet Union, and from 1952 onwards also the United Kingdom, conducted extensive nuclear testing programs. Just to put this into perspective, the US tested its first atomic bomb in 1945 and its first hydrogen bomb in 1952. The Soviet Union, as I have said, tested its first atomic bomb in 1942 and tested its first hydrogen bomb in 1953. Britain, however, came third and tested its first atomic bomb in 1952 and its first hydrogen bomb in 1957. So during the 1950s, in particular during the second half of the 1950s, with these extensive testing programs underway, there are significant environmental issues attached to nuclear testing, fallout, radionuclides, and so on. And so this really triggers a nuclear test ban debate in Britain, the United States, and other countries. There's one particular event which I have to mention in this context, and this is the so-called Lucky Dragon incident, which occurred in 1954. This tragic incident revolved around the crew of a Japanese fishing vessel called the Lucky Dragon. And they suffered radioactive contamination from a US hydrogen bomb test in the South Pacific. The Lucky Dragon incident revealed the hazards from hydrogen bombs and from radioactive debris, and was crucial in fueling a global nuclear test ban debate. Eventually, this debate would lead to the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963, banning nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. And again, imagine in 1954 when these sailors were out in their boat outside the designated danger zone of the Castle Bravo nuclear test, as it was called. They were exposed to severe radioactive fallout, and when they docked at their Japanese home port some 2 weeks later, they faced symptoms of radiation sickness, and one of the crew members instantly died. And this was so powerful, these images were so powerful, that it actually sparked the Godzilla films in Japan. So popular culture even responded to the nuclear threat. One of the chief symbols you're probably familiar with is the nuclear mushroom cloud. And this really emerges during this time as one of the key icons of the anti-nuclear movement. And it, again, is a symbol which reveals the destructive power of atomic energy and atomic weapons in particular. The British and American governments attempted to calm nuclear fears of radiation and global annihilation through extensive civil defense campaigns. By 1955, secret government reports had revealed that there was no working defense against a full-blown thermonuclear attack against Britain or the United States. However, the government still attempted to calm down people's nerves about the impending nuclear threat. There are a couple of very popular and very famous examples of this, such as the Duck and Cover campaign, which promoted hiding under a table to shelter from fallout, for example, and this was widely taught in schools at the time. There were also fallout shelters widely established in Britain and in particular in the United States. Still today you find fallout shelter signs in many public service buildings, schools, and so on. Simultaneously, however, a broad anti-nuclear movement emerged in Britain, the United States, West Germany, and other particular Western European countries against the nuclear threat. In Britain, the campaign for nuclear disarmament emerged in 1958 and held its first Aldermaston March from the nuclear weapons research establishment to the city centre of London in Easter 1958, and this really sparked the Easter March movement, which is still ongoing today. However, nuclear fears peaked in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which almost brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis marks one of the most critical points of the Cold War, where the conflict almost turned hot. After several attempts by the US government to oust Fidel Castro in Cuba, who was at the time the Cuban leader, and especially in the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and the deployment of US nuclear missiles to Turkey, the Soviet and Cuban governments reached an agreement which permitted Moscow to station medium and intermediate range nuclear missiles on Cuban soil. When a US reconnaissance plane spotted missile sites that were being constructed in Cuba in October 1962, the Kennedy administration took immediate action and demanded the Soviet government abandon its plans to deploy nuclear missiles to Cuba immediately. To underline its determination, Washington imposed a naval blockade to quote-unquote quarantine the island nation. The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev regarded the blockade as an act of war, and this confrontation of the two superpowers and their official insistence on their demands led the world to the brink of nuclear war. The crisis was finally resolved through back-channel diplomacy, with the US government issuing a statement that they would not invade Cuba and withdraw nuclear missiles from Turkey. However, it's important to mention that these missiles would have in fact been decommissioned soon anyways. The Soviet side in return withdraw its military hardware and personnel from the Caribbean island. So dangerous was the Cuban Missile Crisis that a direct red line, a hotline, a direct telephone line was installed between Moscow and Washington after the crisis, so that the Soviet and US leaders could get in direct touch in case of any future event like this. Now, to conclude, by 1963, through the implementation of the Partial Test Ban Treaty, the nuclear threat has temporarily lost its immediate urgency. In addition, the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 had cemented the division of Europe and, as historian Mark Trachtenberg has argued, also stabilized conditions in Europe. As a result of the waning of this direct threat posed by nuclear weapons, the first cycle of anti-nuclear activism ended.